Hi everyone. Today we are going to study the different types of documentations that can be done for a system. So, the four main types of documentations are the system requirements specification, system design specification, test design document and user manual. So, these are the four different types of documentations that can be done for any system. Any software project is associated with a large number of documents depending upon the complexity of the project. So, basically the number of documents that any software project will have depends upon how big and complex the software is. If it is a very big and complex software project, it will have larger number of documents, and if it is a relatively less complex and small software project, then it will have lesser number of documents. Now, these documents are used by different types of audience in different ways as follows. By audience, I mean the people who will be using those documents. So, there are different categories of users who will be using those documents, and according to those documents, according to those audience or people, they will be used in different ways. So, they act as a means of communication between the members of the development team. So, as I was talking about different types of users or different types of audience. So, the first type of audience or users is the members of the development team who are developing the software project. So, for them the document serves the purpose of communication. So, it acts as a means of communication between the members of the development team. And these documents are also used by the maintenance engineers who will be maintaining the software project after it is implemented at the customer's site. So, for them it will be used as a reference document for the purpose of maintenance. Documents are used by user for operation of the software. For users, they serve a different purpose. Users who will be using the software project, they refer to the documents to know how they can operate the software. Documents are used by system administrator to administer the system, and when it comes to a system administrator who is a different category of user or who is a different audience, they use those documents to administer the system. So, precisely the same document serves different purpose for different audience. Now, let us start with the type of documents. As we saw that the four different types of documents are the system requirement specification, system design specification, test design document and the user manual. So, starting with the first type of documentation, that is system requirement specification. In today's video, we will study this documentation, which is the system requirements specification. The system requirement specification is also known as SRS. System requirement specification is a set of complete and precisely stated properties along with the constraints of the system that software must satisfy. So, basically this is a kind of documentation wherein all the properties of the software system are stated along with what their constraints are. So, these things are mentioned in a system requirement specification or SRS document. The SRS should specify only the external system behavior and not the internal details. So, internally how the software works, these things should not be specified by the SRS. It should only specify external system behavior as to how the system will function. A good SRS is flexible to change and acts as a reference tool for system developers, administrator and maintainer. So, basically we say a SRS document is good if it is flexible, because over the period of time changes are required in any software project. So, if the changes are done in the software project, the changes in the SRS must also be made. So, a SRS must be flexible enough to accommodate any changes in future as and when required, and it acts as a reference tool for the people who develop the system, that is the system developers, the system administrators and the maintenance engineers who will be maintaining the software project or the system on a continuous basis. Now, let us look at the characteristics of a system requirement specification or SRS document. All the requirements of a SRS must be stated unambiguously. The first characteristic states that whatever the requirements of an SRS are, they must be stated unambiguously. And when I say that they must be stated unambiguously, that means that every requirement that is stated in the SRS must have only one interpretation. So, it should be interpreted in the same way by all the people who are reading it. Every characteristic of the final product must be described using a single and a unique term. Then the second characteristic of an SRS is that it should be complete. So, when I say it should be complete, it means that the definition should include all functions and constraints which are intended by the system user. And in addition to the requirements of the system as specified by the user, it must conform to any standard that it applies to. The third characteristic of an SRS is that the requirement must be realistic and achievable with current technology. So, this means that there is no point in specifying requirements which are unrealistic using existing hardware and software technology. So, the requirements should match the existing hardware and software technology, and there should not be any requirement which cannot be achieved using the current or existing hardware and software technology. It may be acceptable to anticipate some hardware developments, but development in software technology are much less predictable. So, you should always state requirements as per the current or existing hardware and software technology. The fourth characteristic of any SRS is that it must be verifiable and consistent. So, when I say that it must be verifiable and consistent, it means that the requirements stated in the SRS or shown in the SRS must be consistent and they must be verifiable also. So, the requirements are basically verified by the system tester during system testing, and all the requirements stated must be verifiable to know conformity to the requirements. No requirement should conflict with any other requirement. The fifth characteristic of an SRS is that it should be modifiable. When I say it should be modifiable, that means the structure and the style of the SRS are such that any necessary changes to the requirements can be made easily, completely and consistently. That means throughout the SRS document. The sixth characteristic of any SRS is that it should be traceable to other requirements and related documents. Now, this means that the origin of each requirement must be clear. From where that requirement has arisen, that should be clear. The SRS should facilitate the referencing of each requirement for future development or enhancement of documentation, and each requirement must refer to its source in previous documents. Now, the seventh and last characteristic of any SRS is that it should not only address the explicit requirements, but also implicit requirements, because implicit requirements are those requirements that may come up during the maintenance phase of the software. Explicit requirements are those that are explicitly stated by the user, but as you are developing or maintaining the system, there may come up some requirements which come automatically during the maintenance phase for the proper maintenance of the system. So, those are the implicit requirements. So, by the seventh point, we mean to say that not just the explicit requirements, but the implicit requirements which come up during the maintenance phase of the software must also be addressed by the SRS. and it must be usable during operation and maintenance phase also. So, the SRS must basically address the needs of the operation and the maintenance phase, including the eventual replacement of the software if required during the maintenance. Now, let us look at the structure of a typical SRS document. That means how a typical SRS document looks like. So, it starts with the introduction. An SRS document always starts with the introduction, and in the introduction it is specified that what the system reference and business objectives are. Goals and objectives of the software are specified in the introduction, which describe it in the context of the computer based system, and the scope of the document is also specified in the introduction part. Then comes the informative description about this system. In this part, information flow is represented using various diagrammatic representations. Information content and structure are represented over here. Descriptions of various subsystems and the interface between those subsystems and the systems are described here. A detailed descriptions of the problems that the software must solve is given here. Details of information flow, content and structure are documented over here. Hardware, software and user interfaces are described for the external system in this second point. Then the third step is functional description of the system. In the functional description of the system, a functionality of the system is described. That means a functional description is given. Then if there are any restrictions or limitations of the system, that are mentioned over here. What are the performance requirements of that system, that is mentioned here. If there are any design constraints of the system, that are mentioned over here. And diagrams to represent the overall structure of the software graphically is given over here. Then the fourth part of the SRS document is the test and validation criteria. So, in the test and validation criteria, the performance limitation of the system, if any, is specified in this part. What is the expected response from the software, that is specified over here. And for that reason, it is essential that some time and attention must be given to this section, which is your test and validation criteria. Then there is a glossary part of the SRS document. This glossary part basically gives the definitions of all technical or software specific terms which are used in the document. So, you can know that whenever you come across those terms, what does that term refer to, what technical or software specification is that term referring to. The definition of all terms are given in the glossary. Then comes the bibliography part. In this, the list and reference of all documents that are related to the software are given. So, basically all the references and lists are given here. And last part is the appendix part, which basically gives you supplementary or additional information about the specification. So, this is the typical structure of any SRS document. So, this was your software requirement specification or the SRS document. In the next video, we will study the another type of documentation, which is your system design specification.